The dust cloud appeared first on the horizon, but it wasn't moving like anything they had ever seen before. Jake Morrison squinted through the heat shimmer of that August afternoon in 1896, his weathered hand shading his eyes. No hoofbeats, no thunder of a stampede, just a strange mechanical coughing that grew louder with each passing second. His horse, Thunder, shifted nervously beneath him, ears flicking back and forth at the alien noise approaching their world. Then they saw it. A horseless carriage, black as midnight, lurching and sputtering across the open range like some mechanical beast. Jake's partner, Tom Bradley, let out a low whistle that barely masked the tremor in his voice. They'd heard rumors in town, whispers of such contraptions back east, but seeing one here in their territory felt like witnessing the impossible. The machine drew closer, and they could make out a man in a bowler hat gripping what looked like a ship's wheel. If you're feeling that same sense of witnessing history unfold, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what moment in time you'd want to witness. Don't forget to subscribe because we're diving deep into these pivotal moments that changed everything. The driver brought his mechanical marvel to a shuddering halt, just 50 yards from where the Cowboys sat frozen in their saddles. For a moment, the only sound was the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal and the nervous snorting of their horses. The man in the bowler hat climbed down, his city clothes already coated with prairie dust, and approached them with a businessman's confident stride. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying the crisp accent of Chicago, "you've just witnessed the future of transportation." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach, though he couldn't yet name what it was. Tom dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling as he walked toward the machine, drawn by curiosity despite his growing unease. "How fast does she go?" Tom asked, running his calloused hand along the automobile's polished fender. 12 miles per hour on good roads," the businessman replied with obvious pride. "And she never gets tired, never needs rest." Never gets tired. The words hit Jake like a physical blow, and he saw his own fear reflected in Tom's suddenly pale face. They'd spent their entire lives understanding horses, reading their moods, caring for their needs, building partnerships that ran deeper than words. "What about feed?" Tom's voice came out rougher than intended. "What does it eat?" "Gasoline," came the reply, "costs about 2 cents a gallon, and you can buy it anywhere civilization reaches." Anywhere civilization reaches. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a distant wildfire. Jake finally dismounted, his legs unsteady as he approached the machine that seemed to mock everything he'd ever known. He peered into the engine compartment, trying to understand the maze of pipes and pistons that somehow replaced 1,000 years of partnership between man and horse. "How do you talk to it?" Jake asked quietly, the question revealing more vulnerability than he'd intended. The businessman laughed, not unkindly, but the sound still cut through Jake like a blade. "You don't talk to it, friend. You simply drive it. No relationship required, no trust to build, no years of learning its temperament." Tom turned away, walking back toward his horse with steps that seemed to carry the weight of a dying world. Jake watched his partner's retreat and felt something breaking inside his chest, something that had nothing to do with the machine before him. "How many of these are there?" Jake's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Hundreds already. Thousands soon. Every major city back east has them now. It's only a matter of time before they're everywhere." Jake nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him like cold water through a broken dam. The businessman climbed back into his mechanical marvel, cranked the engine to life, and continued his journey west, leaving only dust and the smell of burning oil. The two cowboys stood in silence as the sound faded, their horses nickering softly behind them, unaware that their world had just ended. Tom finally broke the silence, his voice thick with emotion he'd never learned to express. "What do we do now, Jake? What do we do when the thing you've built your whole life around just stops mattering?" Jake had no answer, because sometimes the hardest truth to face is that the world moves forward, whether we're ready or not. That night, Jake Morrison sat by his campfire, staring into flames that seemed to flicker with the ghosts of everything he'd ever known. Tom had ridden back to town hours ago, claiming he needed supplies, but Jake knew better. His partner needed whiskey more than beans, needed the numbing comfort of the saloon more than another night under stars that suddenly felt cold and distant. Thunder stood nearby, occasionally stamping his hooves and snorting softly, as if sensing his master's troubled thoughts. Jake reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a letter, 3 weeks old now, from his sister back in Kansas. She'd written about the changes coming to their hometown, about factories being built where cattle once grazed. Progress, she'd called it, but sitting here in the vast Montana darkness, that word tasted like ashes in his mouth. He'd been born in 1858, had learned to ride before he could properly walk, had spent 38 years believing that horses and men were partners in taming this wild country. Now, in the span of one afternoon, that entire world had been reduced to nothing more than a quaint relic of the past. He folded the letter carefully and looked up at the stars, the same constellations that had guided cowboys across these plains for decades. But even they seemed different now, as if that mechanical beast had somehow altered the very fabric of the night itself. Thunder nickered softly and moved closer, his warm breath visible in the cooling air. Jake reached up and stroked the animal's neck, feeling the familiar comfort of muscle and warmth beneath his palm. "What happens to you, old friend?" he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion he'd kept buried all too. The horse couldn't answer, of course, but Jake felt the animal's trust in the way Thunder leaned into his touch. It was a trust built over years of shared dangers, of reading each other's moods, of depending on one another for survival in this unforgiving land. How do you explain to a horse that the world no longer needs what he was born to give? Jake remembered the businessman's words about gasoline costing 2 cents a gallon, and he did the arithmetic in his head. Feed for Thunder cost nearly 50 cents a day, and that was when grass was scarce and hay had to be bought. The numbers told a story more brutal than any winter storm, more final than any drought. He thought about the ranchers he knew, men who employed dozens of cowboys, who moved thousands of head of cattle across hundreds of miles. If machines could replace horses, how long before they replaced the men who rode them? The sound of hoofbeats interrupted his dark thoughts, and he looked up to see Tom returning, swaying slightly in his saddle. His partner dismounted clumsily, the smell of whiskey preceding him like a cloud of desperation. "Talk to some folks in town," Tom said, his words slightly slurred, but his eyes sharp with pain. "Henderson's selling his spread. Says he can't compete with the railroad bringing beef from Chicago." Jake nodded, unsurprised but still feeling each word like a physical blow. "Miller's boy came back from Denver last week. Says they got electric lights there now, bright as daylight even at midnight. And telephones. You can talk to someone 100 miles away, just like they were sitting right next to you." Jake poked at the fire, with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness like dying stars. "Seems like the whole world's changing faster than we can keep up," he said quietly. Tom pulled out a bottle and offered it to Jake, who shook his head but didn't judge his partner's need for numbness. "You know what scares me most?" Tom's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's not that we might lose our jobs. It's that everything we know how to do, everything we're good at, might just stop mattering." Jake understood completely, because the same fear had been gnawing at him since that mechanical beast had coughed its way across their horizon. They sat in silence after that, two men watching their campfire burn down, while the world they'd known burned down around them. Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath their cold light. Sometimes the hardest part of change isn't adapting to what's coming, but letting go of what's already gone. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana prairie, finding Jake Morrison still awake, still staring at the ashes of his dead campfire. Tom lay curled in his bedroll nearby, the empty whiskey bottle catching the early light like a monument to their shared despair. Thunder stood with his head low, occasionally pawing at the ground as if sensing the weight of uncertainty that hung over them all. Jake rose stiffly, his joints protesting after a night spent wrestling with thoughts that offered no comfort, no easy answers. He walked to the edge of their camp and looked out across the endless grassland that had been his world, his purpose, his identity for nearly 4 decades. In the distance, he could see the faint line of the railroad tracks, those twin ribbons of steel that had already begun reshaping everything they touched. The rails had brought settlers, brought cattle buyers from back east, brought the very businessman whose mechanical beast had shattered their certainty. Tom stirred behind him, groaning as consciousness brought back the full weight of yesterday's revelation. "Coffee?" Jake asked, though his voice carried none of its usual morning strength. Tom nodded and began rolling up his bedding, with movements that seemed mechanical, automatic, drained of their usual purpose. As Jake built a new fire, he found himself wondering how many more mornings like this they had left. How many more camps? How many more rides across open country? How many more partnerships between man and horse? The coffee boiled bitter and strong, the way cowboys had made it for generations, but even that tradition felt fragile now. Tom accepted his cup with hands that shook slightly. Whether from whiskey or fear, Jake couldn't tell. "I've been thinking," Tom said finally, his voice rough with emotion and sleeplessness. "Maybe we're looking at this all wrong. Maybe there's still a place for us in whatever's coming." Jake wanted to believe his partner's words, wanted to find comfort in the possibility of adaptation, of survival. But he had seen the look in that businessman's eyes, the casual dismissal of everything they represented. "Tom," he said gently, "when's the last time you saw a blacksmith working in town?" The question hung between them like smoke, because they both knew the answer. Old Murphy's smithy had closed 2 years ago, when the railroad started bringing in manufactured horseshoes and tools from Chicago. Murphy himself had moved to Billings, taken work in a factory making parts for those same machines that had replaced his craft. "That's different," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction, and they both heard the hollow ring of desperate hope. Jake poured the rest of his coffee onto the fire, watching the flames hiss and die in a cloud of steam. "We should head back to the ranch," he said, though the words felt like surrender. They packed their gear in silence, each lost in thoughts too painful to share, too real to ignore. As they mounted their horses, Jake felt Thunder's familiar strength beneath him, and wondered how many more times he'd experienced this simple pleasure. The ride back to the Rockingham Ranch took them past Henderson's spread, where they could see men loading furniture onto wagons. Henderson himself stood in his doorway, a broken man watching his life's work, being reduced to what could fit in 3 wagons. Jake touched his hat brim in respectful acknowledgement as they passed, and Henderson returned the gesture with eyes that held no hope. "There goes another one," Tom muttered, but his anger had burned out, leaving only hollow acceptance. By noon they could see the Rockingham buildings in the distance, the familiar sight that had always meant home and security. But even from miles away, Jake could sense that something had changed, that the very air around the place felt different. As they drew closer, they saw other riders gathered near the main house, their horses standing with heads low in the afternoon. Heat. Jake recognized most of them, men he'd worked with for years, men whose faces now carried the same haunted look he'd seen in his own reflection. Whatever news waited for them at the ranch house, Jake knew it wouldn't be good. Sometimes the hardest journey isn't the one that takes you somewhere new, but the one that brings you home to find everything has changed. Boss Mackenzie stood on the porch of the main house, his weathered face grave as stone, a telegram crumpled in his fist. The gathered cowboys shifted uneasily in their saddles, sensing the weight of whatever words that paper carried. Jake and Tom dismounted slowly, their boots hitting the dust with the finality of men walking toward their own judgment. "Boys," Mackenzie's voice carried across the yard like the toll of a funeral bell. "I got word from the cattle buyers in Chicago." He smoothed the telegram against his leg, as if the gesture could somehow change the words written there. "They're canceling our contract. Say they can get beef shipped by rail from Kansas for half what it costs to drive cattle from here." The silence that followed was deeper than any canyon, more complete than the vastness of the prairie itself. Jake felt his world tilt sideways, the same sensation he'd experienced watching that mechanical beast cross their horizon. "What about the spring drive?" asked Charlie Watts, his voice barely above a whisper. Mackenzie shook his head slowly, each movement driving another nail into the coffin of their way of life. "There won't be a spring drive, Charlie. There won't be any more drives." Tom's horse stamped nervously, as if the animal could sense the despair radiating from its rider. "I'm keeping the ranch," Mackenzie continued, "but I'll only need 2 men to tend the remaining stock. 2 men out of 12. The arithmetic was as brutal as a winter blizzard, as final as a bullet. Jake looked around at faces he had known for years, men who'd shared dangers and hardships, laughter and sorrow. Now they were all competitors for the few remaining scraps of their dying profession. "I'll give each man a month's pay and a good recommendation," Mackenzie said, his voice thick with genuine regret. "But I won't lie to you. There ain't many places left that need what we do." One by one, the cowboys began to dismount, their movements heavy with the weight of endings. Some shook Mackenzie's hand, others simply nodded and walked away, too proud or too broken for words. Jake watched Charlie Watts, barely 22, stare at his hands as if they'd suddenly become foreign objects. Those hands knew rope and leather, horse and cattle, but what use were such skills in a world of machines? Tom walked over to Jake, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. 38 years, Tom said quietly. 38 years, and it's over just like that. Jake put his hand on his friend's shoulder, feeling the tremor of a man trying not to break. "We'll figure something out," Jake said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Around them, the other cowboys were saddling up for the last time, preparing to ride toward uncertain futures. Some would try their luck in the mining camps. Others might head for the cities where factories promised steady wages. But Jake knew that none of them would ever again feel the freedom of open country beneath a horse's hooves. Thunder nuzzled Jake's shoulder, the horse's warm breath a reminder of the partnership that had defined his life. "What happens to the horses?" Jake asked Mackenzie, dreading the answer. "Sold to whoever will take them," came the reply, each word hitting Jake like a physical blow. Jake pressed his face against Thunder's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and leather and freedom. In that moment, he understood that he wasn't just losing a job, he was losing his identity, his purpose, his very soul. The sun was setting as Jake finally mounted Thunder for what might be their final ride together. As they rode away from the rocking M, Jake felt the weight of history itself, the knowledge that he had witnessed the death of an entire way of life. Sometimes progress isn't about what we gain, but about what we're willing to sacrifice and whether we remember to honor what we've lost.